One daughter is a doctor, the other one is the newly hired maid. My sister Amanda said it like she had just delivered the best joke of the evening. She lifted her wine glass slightly and looked around the Thanksgiving table as if she were waiting for applause. 18 people were sitting in my parents' dining room that afternoon in Ashford Ridge, North Carolina. Relatives, neighbors, and a few local business owners my sister had carefully invited. One by one, the laughter spread across the table. Some of it was polite, some of it was genuine. Amanda's smile grew wider as the room filled with amusement. I kept my eyes on my plate and said nothing. Moments like this had happened before. Usually the laughter passed quickly and people moved on to another topic, but this time something different happened. My 9-year-old daughter Emma tugged gently on my sleeve and leaned closer to me. Her voice was small, curious, and just loud enough for several people nearby to hear. "Mommy, is being a maid something people should be ashamed of?" The laughter stopped almost instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the joke that had caused it. I slowly placed my fork down on the plate and looked around the table. 18 pairs of eyes were suddenly paying attention to me. I pushed my chair back and stood up. But before I tell you what happened next at that dinner table, you need to understand how I became the maid in my own family. My name is Naomi Parker. I am 35 years old, and for the past 4 years my family has introduced me to people as the daughter who helps around the house. Ashford Ridge is a small lakeside town where reputation matters more than most people like to admit. Everyone knows which family owns which property near the water, who attends the same church every Sunday morning, and whose name appears on donation plaques at community events. In a place like this, the story people believe about you can become almost as powerful as the truth itself. My parents understood that better than anyone. My father believed success was something people should see immediately. A good career, a large house, the right connections. My mother believed appearances protected the family's reputation. As long as people admired our family from the outside, everything else would eventually work itself out. My older sister Amanda had always been the perfect daughter for that kind of world. She married Victor Prescott, a real estate investor whose family had lived around the lake for generations. Amanda spent most of her time organizing charity dinners, community fundraisers, and social gatherings that brought together the most influential people in town. Whenever my parents hosted guests, Amanda was the daughter proudly introduced to everyone. She represented success, confidence, and social polish. I was the other daughter, the one people asked about only after noticing the small guest cottage behind my parents' house. 4 years before that Thanksgiving dinner, I arrived back in Ashford Ridge with 2 suitcases and a 2-year-old child on my hip. My marriage had ended suddenly and painfully. My ex-husband had emptied our joint bank account and disappeared before I fully understood what was happening. By the time I realized how serious the situation was, he had already moved several states away. I still remember standing on my parents' porch that afternoon, holding Emma while the late summer air drifted across the lake. My father opened the door, looked briefly at the bags beside me, and then at my daughter. He didn't ask many questions. Instead, he said there was a small cottage behind the house where I could stay until I figured out my next step. The cottage was simple, barely large enough for the 2 of us. It had a small bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a bathroom with an old shower that lost hot water after a few minutes. But it gave us a place to start again. Within 2 weeks, I began cleaning vacation homes around the lake. Most of those houses belonged to families from Charlotte or Raleigh who visited only a few weekends each year. They needed someone to clean the properties, prepare them for guests, and check on things while they were away. The work was exhausting, but honest. Every day I drove around the lake carrying supplies, cleaning kitchens, changing bed sheets, and restocking cabinets before the next set of visitors arrived. Over time, the work became something familiar. I learned which homes required the most attention and which owners cared deeply about how their property was maintained. I also noticed something else that most people overlooked. Many of those houses were beautiful but poorly managed. Owners struggled to coordinate repairs, cleaning, and guest visits from hundreds of miles away. Standing inside those empty homes, I began noticing patterns, problems that repeated themselves again and again. At first, those observations were just quiet thoughts in my mind. By the end of that first year back in Ashford Ridge, I had cleaned more than 50 different vacation homes around the lake, and somewhere during those long days of work, an idea started forming. It was an idea that had nothing to do with being a maid and everything to do with building something bigger. The kind of opportunity most people never noticed because they were too busy laughing at the wrong part of the story. The first winter after I returned to Ashford Ridge was the quietest season I had ever experienced in my life. The lake became still and gray, and most of the vacation homes sat empty for weeks at a time. Snow rarely stayed long in North Carolina, but the cold wind rolling across the water made the mornings feel sharp and lonely. I would wake up before sunrise in the small cottage behind my parents' house, wrap Emma in a warm jacket, and drive her to a neighbor who watched children during the day. After that, my car would slowly circle the lake roads for hours as I cleaned houses that belonged to people who only appeared on weekends. Those houses were beautiful, in a way that sometimes made me pause for a moment before starting work. Large windows facing the water, wooden decks stretching toward private docks, kitchens designed for large family gatherings that rarely happened. Most of the owners lived in cities like Charlotte, Raleigh, or Atlanta. They came for vacations, holidays, or quiet weekends away from their busy lives. When they left, the houses returned to silence. My job was to prepare them for the next arrival. At first, the work felt purely physical, scrubbing countertops, vacuuming carpets, replacing linens, checking refrigerators, restocking towels. But after several months, something changed in the way I saw those houses. Instead of simply cleaning them, I started noticing how they were managed. Every property seemed to have the same small problems. Landscaping crews arrived on the wrong day. Repairs were delayed because no one local coordinated contractors. Guests sometimes arrived before the cleaning had been finished. Owners constantly called different people trying to solve small issues that should have been handled easily. One afternoon, while I was finishing work at a large cedar house near the north side of the lake, the owner unexpectedly arrived early from Charlotte. He walked through the property while I was wiping the kitchen counter. I apologized for still being there, but he waved it off and began looking around the rooms. After a few minutes, he said something that stayed with me long after I drove away that day. "You run this place better than the company we hired," he said casually. "Honestly, someone local should manage these homes full-time." The comment sounded simple, but it planted a thought that refused to leave my mind. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to every property I cleaned. Who coordinated repairs when something broke? Who inspected the house between guest visits? Who made sure supplies were ready when owners arrived for the weekend? Most of the time, the answer was the same. No one did all of it. Different people handled small parts of the work, but no one managed the entire system. While I was learning these things, my family continued seeing my life in the simplest possible way. At family dinners, Amanda often joked about my new career. She would laugh and say that I had become very good at domestic work. My parents usually smiled politely and changed the subject. The comments didn't surprise me anymore. In Ashford Ridge, people believed success looked a certain way. Cleaning houses did not fit that image. But every evening when Emma fell asleep in the cottage bedroom, I opened my laptop and began researching something new. I read about property management companies that coordinated maintenance, guest services, and operations for vacation homes. I studied how contracts were written and how service fees were structured. Some nights I stayed awake long past midnight making notes about how a small local company could operate around Ashford Ridge. The idea felt risky at first. I had no office, no employees, and very little money. But I did have something else that mattered just as much. I already knew the houses. I understood the patterns of the lake community better than most people who only visited a few weekends a year. A month later, I filled out the paperwork to register a small company with the state. I named it Blue Harbor Property Management after the color the lake turned just before sunset. The company existed only on paper at the beginning. There was no office sign, no staff, and no fancy website. But it was real. The first 3 contracts came from homeowners who already trusted me. Instead of hiring me only to clean the house, they agreed to let me manage everything related to the property. I would coordinate maintenance, schedule cleaning crews, check the house between visits, and make sure every guest arrived to a home that was ready. Those first agreements were small, but they changed something inside me. For the first time since my marriage collapsed, I felt like I was building something instead of simply surviving. My family still believed I spent my days cleaning houses around the lake. What they didn't know was that Blue Harbor had just taken its first quiet step into becoming something much bigger. By the beginning of the second year after I registered Blue Harbor Property Management, my days looked almost identical to the ones people in Ashford Ridge thought they understood. I still drove around the lake with cleaning supplies in the back of my car. I still parked in the gravel driveways of large vacation homes and carried laundry baskets through quiet hallways. To anyone passing by, nothing about my life seemed different. That illusion worked perfectly for me. The real changes were happening quietly behind the scenes. The 3 houses that first trusted Blue Harbor quickly showed me how much responsibility true property management required. Cleaning was only one small part of the system. I had to coordinate repair technicians, schedule lawn maintenance, inspect homes after storms, and make sure every property was ready when owners or guests arrived. If a water heater failed on a Friday evening, I had to solve the problem before the weekend visitors arrived. If a guest lost a key late at night, I was the one driving across the lake to unlock the door. Every challenge taught me something about how the business should operate. Soon, word began to travel quietly among homeowners. People who owned lake properties often spoke to one another during weekend gatherings or boat rides. If one house ran smoothly while another struggled with constant problems, people noticed. One homeowner recommended Blue Harbor to a friend who owned a larger property near the southern side of the lake. That property required regular maintenance inspections and guest coordination for short-term rentals. Managing it forced me to develop more organized systems for scheduling work and tracking repairs. Within a year, the number of contracts doubled. 3 houses became 6, and 6 quickly became 10. I began working with a small group of local workers who helped with cleaning and basic maintenance tasks. Most of them were neighbors who had lived around the lake for years and understood how seasonal properties operated. I coordinated their schedules carefully, making sure every property was inspected regularly and prepared for unexpected guest visits. The business was still small, but it had begun to develop a structure that felt stable. Balancing all of this with raising Emma alone required constant adjustments. She spent many afternoons riding in the passenger seat of my car while I checked houses around the lake. Sometimes she colored pictures at the kitchen tables of empty vacation homes while I finished inspections. Other times, she sat quietly beside me in the cottage while I answered emails from property owners asking about repairs or scheduling. She never complained. In her eyes, the long drives around the lake felt like small adventures. One spring afternoon, an email arrived that almost changed everything before it even began. The message came from an assistant representing Brooks Development Group, a real estate firm based in Charlotte. They owned several luxury estates around Ashford Ridge and were searching for a reliable local company to oversee property management for those homes. At first, I assumed the email had been sent by mistake. Blue Harbor was still a small operation, and companies like Brooks Development usually worked with larger firms. But curiosity convinced me to reply. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was inspecting a lakeside deck that had been damaged during a storm. The caller introduced himself as Daniel Brooks, the founder of Brooks Development Group. His voice was calm and direct as he asked questions about how Blue Harbor handled maintenance schedules, contractor coordination, and guest arrivals. I answered as honestly as I could, explaining the systems I had built and the properties I was currently managing. When the conversation ended, Daniel said something that surprised me. 2 of the homeowners already working with Blue Harbor had recommended my company to him personally. A week later, we met in person at one of the large estates his company owned on the western side of the lake. The property overlooked a quiet stretch of water and required constant maintenance because it was frequently rented to guests. I walked Daniel through the inspection process I used for every property. I explained how cleaning crews were scheduled, how repairs were tracked, and how guest arrivals were coordinated to prevent problems. After nearly an hour of conversation, Daniel looked around the property once more and nodded. "This is exactly what we need here," he said. Within the next 6 months, Blue Harbor signed contracts to manage several properties owned by Brooks Development Group. Each one was larger and more valuable than any home I had managed before. The new responsibilities forced me to hire additional help and develop more structured systems. Slowly, Blue Harbor stopped feeling like a small experiment and began operating like a real company. Yet every Sunday evening when I sat at my parents' dinner table, Amanda still joked about how I spent my days cleaning houses. I never corrected her. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do while building something is remain silent long enough for the truth to reveal itself on its own. What Amanda didn't know was that my business had already begun working closely with the same development company her husband hoped to impress one day. By the start of the 4th year after I returned to Ashford Ridge, Blue Harbor Property Management had quietly grown into something much larger than the small idea I once worked on at my kitchen table. What began as 3 homes slowly expanded into a network of more than 20 vacation properties scattered around the lake. Each one required attention, planning, and constant communication with owners who trusted me to take care of their homes while they lived hours away. Most mornings still began before sunrise. I would wake up in the small cottage behind my parents' house, prepare breakfast for Emma, and drive her to school before starting my rounds around the lake. The difference now was that I no longer handled everything alone. Blue Harbor had grown enough for me to hire a small team. Carla managed scheduling for cleaning crews and guest arrivals. Marcus handled inspections and coordinated contractors when repairs were needed. Another part-time assistant helped organize invoices and maintenance reports. None of them worked in fancy offices or wore business suits, but they were reliable, hard-working people who understood how the lake community functioned. The system we built was simple but effective. Every property received regular inspections. Every guest arrival followed a clear checklist. Every repair was documented and completed quickly. Property owners appreciated the consistency. When they arrived at their vacation homes, everything worked. Lights turned on, linens were clean, and the house felt ready for them. In a business built on trust, that reliability mattered more than anything else. During this same period, my relationship with Daniel Brooks continued to grow stronger. Brooks Development Group owned several of the most valuable estates around Ashford Ridge, and managing those properties required strict attention to detail. Daniel expected clear reports about maintenance schedules, guest feedback, and operational costs. At first, I worried that Blue Harbor might not meet the expectations of a company that large. Instead, Daniel seemed impressed by how efficiently a small local operation could perform when it focused on the details that larger firms sometimes overlooked. More than once, he told me that reliability was far more valuable than size in the property management industry. His company gradually trusted Blue Harbor with more responsibilities around the lake. Each new contract meant more work for our small team, but it also confirmed that the systems we had built were working. Despite all of this progress, nothing about my public image in Ashford Ridge appeared to change. I still lived in the same cottage behind my parents' house. I still drove around town in the same car filled with supplies and maintenance tools. To neighbors who occasionally waved from their docks, I looked exactly the same as I had 4 years earlier. My family continued seeing the same version of my life as well. At social gatherings, Amanda often described my work in the simplest possible way. She told people that I helped maintain some vacation homes around the lake. The way she said it made the work sound small and temporary, like something a person did while waiting for real success to arrive. I rarely corrected her. Explaining the truth would have required conversations I no longer felt interested in having. Meanwhile, the scale of Blue Harbor continued expanding quietly. By the middle of that 4th year, we were responsible for managing 22 vacation estates around Ashford Ridge. Some belonged to private owners, while others were part of the portfolio owned by Brooks Development Group. Together, those properties represented tens of millions of dollars in real estate. My days were filled with calls from owners, inspections with contractors, and planning meetings with my small team. Around the same time, I began hearing a different type of conversation during family dinners. Amanda and her husband Victor had started discussing a new investment opportunity connected to real estate development around the lake. Victor believed Ashford Ridge was about to experience rapid growth as wealthy buyers searched for vacation homes outside larger cities. Through his professional network, he had begun communicating with Brooks Development Group about the possibility of partnering on future projects. Amanda became increasingly excited about the idea. She spoke about it at almost every family gathering, describing how important it would be to make the right impression on Daniel Brooks. According to her, securing a partnership with his company could elevate their position in the local business community. My parents listened proudly while Amanda described the opportunity as if it were already guaranteed. One evening in early November, Amanda announced the plan she believed would make everything work. Daniel Brooks would be visiting the area shortly before Thanksgiving to inspect several properties. Instead of scheduling a formal business meeting, Amanda suggested inviting him to our family's Thanksgiving dinner. The holiday gathering would allow him to meet everyone in a relaxed environment while seeing how respected our family was in the community. My parents loved the idea immediately. Within a few days, the guest list expanded to include 18 people. Relatives, neighbors, and several local business owners were invited to join the dinner. Amanda carefully planned the seating arrangement and menu as if she were organizing a formal reception rather than a family meal. As I listened to these plans unfold around the dinner table, I felt a strange sense of quiet irony. The man Amanda was trying so hard to impress had already trusted my company with some of his most valuable properties. But my family didn't know that yet. And soon the carefully arranged Thanksgiving dinner they were planning would bring those two worlds together in a way none of them expected. The week before Thanksgiving arrived with the quiet rush that always seemed to pass through Ashford Ridge at the beginning of winter. Cars with out-of-state license plates began appearing again along the lake roads, and grocery stores filled with people preparing for the holiday weekend. Families returned to their vacation homes, and the town felt briefly alive again before winter settled in for good. But inside my parents' house, Thanksgiving had become something much more complicated than a family gathering. Amanda had turned the holiday dinner into a carefully planned event. Ever since she learned that Daniel Brooks would be visiting Ashford Ridge that week, she treated Thanksgiving like an opportunity to stage the perfect social moment. Every detail mattered to her. She spoke about the dinner constantly during the days leading up to the holiday. The seating arrangement, the wine selection, the guest list, even the order in which dishes would be served seemed important in Amanda's mind. By Monday evening, she had finalized the list of 18 people who would attend the dinner. A few were relatives who lived nearby. Others were neighbors known for their influence in the local community. There were 2 business owners who Victor believed might support future development projects near the lake. Daniel Brooks and his wife Donna were placed at the center of the seating arrangement, directly across from Amanda and Victor. The positioning was deliberate. Amanda wanted every conversation at the table to highlight the kind of social network she believed would impress someone like Daniel. While Amanda handled invitations and social planning, my role in the preparations was far simpler. My mother asked me to help prepare most of the food and make sure the house was ready for guests. I spent 2 full days cleaning the kitchen, organizing serving dishes, and preparing ingredients for the meal. I didn't mind the work. Cooking had always been something I enjoyed, and the kitchen felt like a calm place compared to the tension building around the dining room table. Amanda occasionally passed through the kitchen while reviewing her plans. Each time she did, she spoke about the dinner as if it were a professional event rather than a family holiday. She reminded my parents how important the evening could be for Victor's future business opportunities. At one point, she glanced at the dishes I was preparing and laughed lightly. "Well, at least we have someone in the family who understands domestic work," she said. The comment earned a small chuckle from my father, who was reading through a list of guests near the counter. My mother didn't respond. She simply continued arranging plates on the table as if the remark had never been made. Emma sat quietly at the kitchen table during most of these preparations, drawing pictures with colored pencils and occasionally asking when the turkey would be ready. She had grown used to spending time in the cottage while I worked, and the busy atmosphere inside the house felt exciting to her. But even children noticed the tone people use when speaking to each other. One evening, while Amanda was reviewing the seating arrangement, Emma leaned toward me and asked why Aunt Amanda always joked about my job. I told her something simple that I had learned during the past 4 years. Some people measure success by titles and appearances. Others measure it by the things they quietly build over time. Emma nodded as if she understood, even though I knew the idea might take years to fully make sense. The irony of the entire situation followed me through those days of preparation. Earlier that same week, I had spoken with Daniel Brooks about 2 new property management contracts Blue Harbor would soon begin handling for his company. The conversation had been calm and professional, just like every other call we had shared during the past year. He had never mentioned the upcoming Thanksgiving dinner invitation directly, but I knew he was aware of it. The thought that our two completely separate worlds would meet at my parents' table kept returning to my mind. On the morning of Thanksgiving, Amanda arrived early to supervise the final details. She moved through the house, adjusting decorations, checking the placement of chairs, and reminding everyone how important the dinner might be for Victor's investment plans. Shortly before the guests arrived, she pulled me aside in the kitchen. Her voice was quieter than usual. She explained that she hoped I would avoid discussing personal matters with the guests. According to her, the evening should remain focused on pleasant conversation and professional topics. Some details of my life, she suggested, might make the atmosphere uncomfortable. I understood exactly what she meant. Amanda didn't want anyone asking questions about the sister who lived in the cottage behind the house and spent her days cleaning lake homes. I could have corrected her in that moment. I could have explained that my company had already worked with Daniel Brooks for more than a year. I could have told her that the man she was trying so hard to impress knew exactly who I was. But instead, I simply nodded. Sometimes the truth reveals itself much more clearly when you allow people to keep believing the wrong story for a little longer. By early afternoon, the house filled with the smell of roasted turkey, herbs, and freshly baked bread. Guests began arriving one by one, greeting my parents and exchanging warm holiday wishes in the living room. At exactly 12:30, a black SUV slowly pulled into the driveway. Amanda glanced through the front window and smiled. Daniel Brooks had arrived, and in just a few minutes, we would all be sitting at the same table. By the time everyone finally sat down at the dining table, the house had grown warm with conversation and the soft clinking of glasses. 18 people filled the long wooden table that overlooked the gray winter surface of Lake Ashford. Candles flickered between serving dishes, and the smell of roasted turkey drifted through the room. Amanda sat near the center beside Victor, smiling as if the entire afternoon had unfolded exactly according to her plan. Daniel Brooks and his wife Donna were seated directly across from them. My parents occupied the head of the table. I took my place quietly near the far end beside Emma. For the first part of the meal, the atmosphere felt relaxed and almost pleasant. Guests complimented the food, shared small stories about travel, and asked Daniel about his company's projects in North Carolina. Amanda guided each conversation carefully, making sure the topics always returned to development opportunities around Ashford Ridge. Victor spoke confidently about how the lake area would soon attract wealthy buyers from larger cities. My father nodded proudly every time Victor described the future of the town. I focused on Emma while the adults talked. I helped her cut pieces of turkey and passed her the bowl of mashed potatoes when she reached for it. From time to time, I noticed Daniel Brooks glance briefly in my direction. His expression remained calm, but it was clear he recognized me from our business meetings. Neither of us acknowledged that fact openly. For the moment, the dinner continued as Amanda had imagined it. Halfway through the meal, one of the guests asked Amanda how many siblings she had. The question sounded harmless enough, but Amanda reacted with the kind of smile that suggested she had been waiting for the opportunity. She lifted her wine glass slightly and turned toward my end of the table. "Yes, I do have a younger sister," she said. For a moment she paused, letting the room settle into silence. Then she gestured toward me with a light laugh. "She's the newly hired maid helping with houses around the lake." The sentence landed exactly the way she intended. Several people laughed immediately. Some assumed it was a harmless family joke. Others laughed simply because Amanda sounded amused by the remark herself. I kept my eyes on the table and said nothing. Moments like this had happened before. Usually they passed quickly and everyone returned to their food. But this time something unexpected happened. Emma tugged gently on my sleeve. Her voice was soft, curious, and clear enough for several people to hear. "Mommy, is being a maid something people should be ashamed of?" The laughter disappeared almost instantly. A few guests looked down at their plates. Others turned their heads toward us, unsure how to respond. The room felt suddenly still, as if the air itself had paused. Amanda's smile faltered for the first time that afternoon. I placed my fork carefully on the edge of my plate. For 4 years, I had listened to small comments like the one Amanda had just made. Most of the time, I ignored them because there were more important things to focus on. but hearing my daughter question whether honest work was something to hide felt different. I rested one hand gently on Emma's shoulder and stood up from my chair. The movement drew everyone's attention immediately. Before I had the chance to say anything, another chair scraped softly against the floor near the center of the table. Daniel Brooks stood. He adjusted the sleeve of his jacket calmly and looked toward Amanda. The entire room seemed to sense that something unexpected was about to happen. No one spoke. Daniel's voice was steady when he finally addressed her. "Out of curiosity," he said, "do you happen to know who manages most of the vacation estates around this lake?" Amanda blinked in confusion. The question clearly caught her off guard. "I'm not sure," she answered slowly. "Different contractors, I suppose. Cleaning services, maintenance companies." Daniel nodded slightly, as if considering the response. Several guests leaned forward with interest, including Victor, who seemed eager to follow any discussion related to property management in the area. Daniel remained standing beside his chair. "Well," he said calmly, "there's actually one company responsible for quite a few of those estates." The room grew quiet again as people waited for him to continue. "And it happens to be a company I work with regularly." Amanda looked puzzled, clearly unsure where the conversation was heading. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly toward me at the end of the table. Then he spoke again. "The company is called Blue Harbor Property Management." The name hung in the air for a moment. A few guests exchanged curious glances. Amanda frowned slightly, trying to remember if she had heard it before. Daniel placed one hand on the back of his chair and continued speaking in the same calm tone. "And the person who founded that company," he turned fully toward my side of the table, "is Naomi Parker." The entire room went completely silent. For a moment after Daniel Brooks spoke my name, the room did not seem to breathe. The quiet that settled over the table was heavier than the laughter that had filled it earlier. 18 people sat frozen in their chairs, their attention slowly shifting from Daniel to me and then back again. Amanda remained motionless, her wine glass still in her hand as if the gesture she had started moments earlier had never finished. Daniel did not raise his voice. He simply continued speaking in the same calm tone that had already changed the entire atmosphere of the room. "Blue Harbor Property Management has been overseeing several estates owned by Brooks Development Group for more than a year," he said. A few guests exchanged surprised glances. Victor leaned slightly forward in his chair, clearly trying to process the information. Daniel nodded politely toward me at the end of the table. "Naomi built the operation herself," he continued. "Her team currently manages more than 20 vacation properties around this lake." The words seemed to move slowly across the room. People who had laughed only minutes earlier now looked uncertain about where to place their attention. Some guests lowered their eyes to their plates. Others studied me quietly as if trying to reconcile the image Amanda had described with the one Daniel was now presenting. Amanda finally set her glass down. Her voice sounded smaller than it had earlier. That can't be right," she said carefully. "Naomi cleans houses around here." Daniel did not react to the remark. Instead, he folded his hands loosely in front of him and answered with quiet certainty. "She started by cleaning houses," he said. "Most good businesses start with someone willing to do the work personally." He paused briefly before continuing. "But Blue Harbor is now responsible for maintaining and coordinating a portfolio of lake properties worth tens of millions of dollars." The sentence seemed to ripple through the room. My father sat perfectly still, staring down at the table as if the polished wood surface suddenly held answers he had never looked for before. My mother glanced between Amanda and me without speaking. Victor's expression tightened slightly as the implications of Daniel's words became clearer. Daniel looked around the table before speaking again. "I have visited Ashford Ridge several times in the past year," he said, "and every time I've come here, Naomi's company has been the reason those properties operated smoothly." A guest seated near the middle of the table nodded slowly. "I've heard of Blue Harbor," he said quietly. "They manage the Carter estate on the north side of the lake." Another guest added that the same company had recently taken over management of a rental property near the marina. Amanda said nothing. Daniel allowed the brief conversation to settle before turning his attention toward Victor. "I understand you were interested in discussing a potential development partnership with Brooks Development Group," he said. Victor straightened slightly, seizing the opportunity to redirect the moment. Yes, he replied. We believe there are several strong opportunities for investment around the lake. Daniel listened politely while Victor explained the proposal he and Amanda had been discussing for weeks. The plan involved new residential development near one of the quieter sections of the shoreline. My parents watched the exchange carefully, clearly hoping the conversation might still return to the confident tone it had held earlier in the evening. When Victor finished speaking, Daniel nodded once. Normally, I would be very interested in hearing more about that kind of project, he said. The room grew quiet again. But business partnerships require more than good locations and financial projections. Daniel's eyes moved calmly across the table before settling briefly on Amanda. They require trust in the judgment of the people involved. Amanda shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Daniel's voice remained steady. When someone is willing to publicly belittle a person whose company they clearly know nothing about, it raises questions about how they treat partners, employees, and clients. Victor's shoulders stiffened. Amanda's face flushed slightly. Daniel continued speaking without changing his tone. For that reason, I'm afraid Brooks Development Group will not be pursuing the investment discussion you mentioned. The words landed with quiet finality. Victor's jaw tightened as he realized the opportunity he had spent months trying to secure had disappeared in front of the entire room. Amanda stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Several guests looked away politely, uncomfortable witnessing the moment unfold. Emma squeezed my hand gently beside my chair. She did not understand business deals or investment partnerships, but she understood that something important had just happened. For the first time that evening, every person at the table was looking toward me instead of Amanda. Daniel had revealed the truth. The laughter had vanished, and now the entire room waited to see what I would do next. The silence that followed Daniel Brooks's decision felt deeper than anything that had happened earlier that afternoon. No one rushed to speak. The laughter that once filled the dining room had completely vanished, replaced by a quiet tension that seemed to settle into every corner of the house. 18 people remained seated around the table, yet the atmosphere no longer resembled a Thanksgiving celebration. It felt more like a moment when everyone realized that the story they believed about someone had just changed. Amanda was the first person to move. She lowered her eyes and adjusted the napkin in her lap, as if concentrating on something small and unimportant. Her confidence from earlier in the evening had disappeared. Victor sat beside her with his arms resting on the table, staring at the wine glass in front of him. The business opportunity he had hoped to secure only an hour earlier had vanished quietly with Daniel's final sentence. My father looked older than he had that morning. His shoulders were slightly slumped as he stared down at the table, absorbing everything that had been revealed. My mother glanced between Amanda and me with an expression that carried confusion more than anything else. It was clear that neither of them had truly understood what my life had become during the past 4 years. I felt Emma's small hand still holding mine beside the chair. That was the moment I realized something important. I had imagined this kind of scene many times during the years when Amanda's jokes and quiet dismissals followed me everywhere. I had imagined defending myself, explaining my work, proving that the story people told about me was incomplete. But standing there in that quiet dining room, I felt none of the anger I once expected. The truth had already been spoken. Daniel Brooks had explained everything far more clearly than I ever could. I rested my hand gently on Emma's shoulder and looked toward my sister. Amanda finally lifted her eyes, but the confident smile she usually carried was gone. For the first time in a long while, she looked uncertain, as if the role she had always played in the family had suddenly shifted in a way she didn't understand. "There's nothing wrong with cleaning houses," I said, quietly. My voice sounded calmer than I expected. Honest work is never something to be ashamed of. A few guests nodded slightly, though no one interrupted. "I started by cleaning those homes because it was the only work available when Emma and I came back here," I continued. "But sometimes the work people overlook is the same work that teaches you how something really operates." Amanda said nothing. Neither did Victor. I looked around the table once more, meeting the eyes of several guests who had laughed earlier in the afternoon. None of them looked amused now. I didn't build Blue Harbor to prove anyone wrong, I said. I built it because my daughter deserved a stable life. Emma squeezed my hand again when I said that. That's really the only part of the story that matters. I gave a small nod toward Daniel Brooks. Thank you for explaining things more clearly than I would have. Daniel simply inclined his head politely. There was nothing else that needed to be said. I picked up Emma's jacket from the back of the chair and helped her slip her arms through the sleeves. She looked around the room with quiet curiosity, still trying to understand why everyone had grown so serious during dinner. Are we leaving, Mommy? She asked softly. Yes, I said with a small smile. Emma held my hand as we walked toward the front door. Behind us, chairs shifted slightly and quiet conversations began again, but I didn't turn around to listen. Some moments in life are easier to leave behind when you walk forward without looking back. Outside, the air felt colder than it had earlier that day. The lake stretched out across the horizon under the pale November sky. Emma climbed into the passenger seat of the car while I started the engine. As we drove away from the house, the cottage behind my parents' property appeared briefly in the rearview mirror. That little building had been our entire world when we first returned to Ashford Ridge. It was where Blue Harbor began as an idea on a laptop after Emma had fallen asleep each night. Life didn't change overnight after that Thanksgiving dinner, but the story people told about me in town slowly began to shift. Some of the guests who attended the dinner eventually called to apologize for laughing earlier that day. Others contacted Blue Harbor about property management services once they understood what the company actually did. The business continued growing steadily. Daniel introduced my company to several new property owners, and our team expanded beyond the lake community. Within a couple of years, Emma and I moved into a small home closer to the water, a place that belonged entirely to the life we had built ourselves. Sometimes I still think about Emma's question at the dinner table. Is being a maid something people should be ashamed of? The truth is that question contained the real lesson of the entire story. Dignity doesn't come from titles or how people describe you at a dinner table. It comes from the work you do and the life you build when no one is paying attention. And if you've ever had a moment in your life when someone underestimated you, then you probably understand that feeling better than anyone. If this story reminded you of a time when you had to rebuild your life quietly or prove your worth through your actions instead of your words, feel free to share it in the comments. Stories like that deserve to be heard. And if you enjoy real-life stories about resilience, family boundaries, and success that grows from difficult beginnings, consider staying with this channel and subscribing. There are many more stories waiting to be told, and sometimes the most powerful ones start exactly the way this one did. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.